Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from this, my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly. And today I've got an extremely special and timely guest. He is a big-time brainiac. He is a poli-sci professor at M.I.T. He's been published extensively about America's military and diplomatic posture in the post-Cold War world. He's been on more councils, has more academic chairs, fellowships and awards than I have time to mention. His opinion pieces have been published in the New York Times and Foreign Affairs magazines, to name a few. He wrote Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy, which I read. And in 2019, he received the Notre Dame International Security Center's Lifetime Achievement Award. Holy cow, talk about big time. Welcome to Rebel Without Applause, Professor Barry Posen. How are you?
Good to be here. Doing well today.
Well, I did enjoy the book, Restraint. I guess, as you mentioned, it was written in...
Published in 2013 or 2014. Even I can't remember 10 years ago. But
Right, and the world has had some serious changes since that moment. I'm just curious, as a way to kick this thing off, has the creed of restraint and the hard lessons of American overreach, has the current moment or the last year or two, has your worldview changed in any way since you wrote the book?
Well, what I was arguing in the book was that when you strip it all away, the United States is inherently quite a secure country. The old argument that I guess maybe Jefferson made about weak neighbors to the north and south and to the east and west fish, it makes us. I think it was Jefferson. It makes us, it makes us inherently pretty secure. And of course, we have one of the largest economies in the world, one of the most diverse economies in the world, a continent that is rich in natural resources, and we're quite adept at military technology. And we live in the nuclear age. It's very hard to truly threaten countries that have nuclear weapons, because if you do, you could get incinerated yourself. So we start from a very secure position. So the question is, how much more do we need to do? And people who study international politics for a living, especially people in the theoretical tradition that I come from, realism, we believe that all countries, need to be attentive to their security interests. And even the United States, given all its benefits, blessings, needs to be attentive. It's sort of things we should continue to do, but not many. Our argument, or the argument of me and many people who agreed with me in the post-Cold War period, was that there were a lot of things the United States kept trying to do that really weren't that fundamental to its interests, with the most questionable of them being the propensity to try and re-engineer the politics of small and medium-sized countries in ways that would make them look more like what we think is the right way to organize society, liberal democracy. And at the beginning of the post-Cold War world, this was already a problem in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, where you had, outbreaks of what people thought was, old-fashioned nationalism, World War I stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened is we've had a lot of encounters with nationalism and identity politics, and it turns out, old-fashioned though it may be, it's a very powerful force within countries and among countries. And even if you come to countries with what you think is a suitcase full of blessings, if you try and force it on them at the point of a bayonet, then they're going to fight you. So this was one of the main things that I was arguing against and others were arguing against, motivated in part by the Balkan Wars, in part by the intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that, I think, stands, right? I mean, what we're seeing now is identity politics is stronger than ever. Now, has that particular message sunk into the American establishment? Maybe yes. But other parts of the message that I was sending have not, right? And we can talk about that.
Well, you came of age during the Vietnam War. And to me, just growing up, although I was too young to be in it, thank God, it seemed to dominate my youth in terms of 64 to 74. I graduated high school. So my whole youth is drenched in this news and this futility and how it divided our society. I'm curious how those events shaped your worldview.
I would say that it shaped it in a lot of different ways. And like you, I think that if you were, not every kid is a kid who watches the news or looks at a newspaper or everything else, or a lot has to do with what's going on in their family and stuff. But I remember feeling like, if I turned on the TV around 6 o'clock or 6:30, it was going to be all war all the time. And the news usually wasn't good, right? As you say, it was like of this thing that just went on, consumed lives, consumed money through the massive application of explosive power, consumed South Vietnam and to some extent North Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, right? So this was in the background, and and it did stick with me, and it did help trigger my interest in the connections between war and politics, right? So it had a very strong effect. And the second effect is what we talked about earlier, which is this kind of fear of and respect for the power of nationalism, the power of identity politics in other cultures, right? And how that identity can be politicized and how it can be turned to the task of war, either offensive war or defensive war. So I think Vietnam, alerted me to the importance of the issue, just what humans could do to each other when they really put their mind to it in a military sense, right? And second, to the importance of identity in politics. I think those were the main things. And then there were some other things like eternal skepticism about professed military expertise. I have lots of friends in the military. Much of what I've learned from them about how things work. But when you gear up a military organization to do something, the cult of positive thinking takes over and it affects everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so those of us who are consuming any military information from any actor, we should have some skepticism in our heads because they get a kind of motivated bias, right? And so that's a problem. And the other thing was like if you're going to be questioning, you have to know what they're doing, which means you kind of have to get your own hands dirty, learning something about how war is made, which I've spent a good bit of my time doing as an academic, not as a practitioner, obviously, and that creates a certain tension in its own right, whereas you talk to soldiers who do the work about the work, and you've never done the work, it creates a kind of not just a barrier to understanding, but it creates a kind of legitimacy problem. Who are you to give me guidance? Who are you to ask these questions? Which takes us to the final observation for Vietnam, and that is the very old adage in war that politics should be the guiding element that comes down to us from Karl von Clausewitz. That was often a missing piece of the Vietnam War. And when people mount critiques of current wars, all of these themes tend to come up again, right? And even I find myself asking in certain situations, well, am I hewing to my earlier understandings here? Or am I deviating from them? Are these people who are in this war, are they however hellish it is, waging a war that makes sense? Or are they waging a war that's senseless and pointless? And the borderline between the senseless and pointless war and the war that makes sense is squishy, and it's the process of war that is one of the things that makes it squishy, because the war wants to get out of your control. The war wants to take over. At some point, you're working for the war. The war's not working for you because it develops, that term that Kurt Vonnegut used to use, the incredible man-made weather,
Yeah.
once the incredible man-made weather gets going, it's not easy for the man to turn the man-made weather off, right? They become prisoners.
As I think about Vietnam, I was there about 10 years ago.
Oh.
And at the time of the war, it was the ideology of this clash between the worldview of communism, and if it's not stopped here, it's going to be in the valley, at Taft High School in San Fernando Valley. But now those ideological clashes seem extremely quaint and distant and irrelevant. And when I was there, all I could see is this place is beautiful. It's kind of a Garden of Eden, the food, the people. And it's just like, what the hell was going on? I don't know anybody today that has had a concern about what, communism, for whatever that means, market communism in Vietnam. It so seems quaint with the distance of time today, those issues that were in our face then.
Even at the time, there were those who argued that our way of organizing the Cold War in the late 50s and early 60s, in an ideological sense, overlooked the other isms, so communism versus liberalism, or whatever we called ourselves. But then there was nationalism, right? And within the communist world, there were all these falling outs among communist countries. China and Russia fell out.
Mm-hmm.
China and Vietnam fell out. right? And there were observers at the time, people, I was just a kid, but, scholars, senior people, analysts who said, we got to get nationalism working for us, not work against it.
Right.
There's no special reason why the Vietnamese are going to be pals of the Chinese forever, and we should, find a way to make these forces work for us. Now, there is a propensity for political leaders to look for simple ways to organize the complicated foreign policies that they choose for any number of reasons. And you can see it today. The Biden administration wants to organize American foreign policy as a struggle between small L liberalism or democracy, D, right? Or the liberal world order, or the US-led liberal world order, or the US-led norms-based liberal world. You use the terms you hear against the
Right.
alliance of autocracies, as
Right.
if the Chinese autocracy, the Iranian autocracy, the North Korean autocracy, and the Russian autocracy were some shared ideological position, and they were united with one another because, not united, but aligned, right? Because of their deep commitment to autocracy and the spreading of autocracy. And Putin doesn't have you don't hear Putin talking about a model that will travel, because if you look at Iran, if you look at North Korea, these all say that we have an ideology and they give some name to it, but it's uniquely ours, right? This is the Russian conservative nationalist way of doing business, and we have to have a strong autocracy because that's what works for Russians,
Hmm.
right? The Chinese are closer to talking about communism, but their society is a market communist system. If they were still, playing the Maoist game, we wouldn't be having a strategic problem with them because they couldn't constitute much of a threat. They started to play our game. That's why they became so powerful, right?
Right. Yeah. So I always feel like China's is integrated into our economy. They have as much to lose with aggression as anybody else.
They do, but you got to be careful with that argument because people have made it in the past, right? I mean, on the eve
Mhm.
of World War One, people said, "Well, the world is interdependent. It doesn't make sense to go to war. Britain and Germany were one another's number one and number two trading partner, et cetera, et cetera."
Mhm.
But when countries have strong security interests or strong, we'll call them ideological, but in this case, we're talking about national sovereignty claims that are attached to their nationalist identity, countries will sacrifice their standard of living for the sake of what they perceive to be their security or their world historical mission, however they define it. Right?
Yeah, and we've seen that. Now, Thomas Friedman, who he's sort of one of my main gurus, he's sort of making the case, not unlike what you just said, between this sort of tenuous alliance between Iran and Putin's Russia and North Korea and maybe even Hezbollah and
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Hamas. And I don't know if they have these conferences, where they all get together and coordinate all this stuff, but there feels like there's some truth there.
Oh no, they are aligned one with the other. But the question is, one question you always have in international politics, one of the things that makes the study of international politics and foreign policy interesting, but also very difficult, is in the abstract, there's two sources of countries' behavior abroad. One is their nature, their hopes, their dreams, their unique forms of government, their nationalist story of themselves. And the other is the system in which they find themselves, the system of nation states in which they live.
Mm-hmm.
And in the system of nation states in which all countries live, that system, theorists use the term anarchy, and it doesn't mean anarchy like, six unsupervised children left in a room full of paintball guns or something. Although it could be similar to that. It
Yeah.
means a system without a lawgiver and a law enforcer, right? So international politics, there's no overarching sovereign. There's no place to go for any country to go and seek adjudication and enforcement if it's been wronged or worse, wronged, threatened, or the worst, had war made upon it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So all countries are always looking after their security to the best of their ability. And the thing that influences how much they do and what kinds of tricks they can pull is their capabilities relative to one another, their power in the simplest sense. And the great powers tend to be eyeballing the other great powers all the time. And if you feel like there's a single great power or a coalition of great powers that, you begin to fear them for one reason or another, you're going to take some measures of your own to improve your security. And you're either going to seek allies or you're going to build up your own military power, or you're going to do both. And the problem with the alignment of autocracies that we see is, yeah, some of it is that they find it easier to get on one with the other because they're not judgy relative to each other because they're all crooks, right?
We're all gangsters.
They're all thugs, right?
Yeah, we're all
They're
gangsters.
right. They're all gangsters. But they also know, gangsters as they are, that they would sell out one another out if they had to. So part of the glue that holds them together is us, right? And that's one of the themes of my book, and that is that it's not just that we define the good way of organizing society or the good way of organizing relations among societies as different from them. It's that we think our way is enough better that we kind of have the right to try and enforce it around the world. And we use our hard power, the threat of our hard power, and our, what Joe and I call soft power, which is to say our money and our media and this, that, and the other, to try and either coerce or cajole others into organizing themselves our way. And of course, from the autocrats' point of view, this is a pistol pointed right at the good deal that they have. But they've managed to convince their citizens that it's a threat because, they're more interested in being Chinese or Russian than they are interested in being Western liberals or whatever it is, right? So, and the final thing is we have so much capability. And this is the thing about the American post-Cold War power position. And just in a raw material sense, we had more capabilities than almost any other single power in history. And because of the way the Cold War ended, our forces were out there all over the world on the borders of all these thugs, right? Glowering at them and saying, we don't like the way you've organized yourself or the way you organized yourself before. And we think it would be better if you did this, that, or the other, right? So from their point of view, we're a problem, we're a threat, and they make common cause. And we can try and unravel how much of this is their thuggish nature and the fact that they get along well, and how much of it is that they all find themselves in one way or the other, in our, I'll use the word gun sights, although that's not quite fair, certainly in our set of goals, things we would like to change and undo, and this causes them to make common cause against us. So a friend of mine has a book called I think it's called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics or something like that. This is the tragic element of it, right?
So we're still then in a unipolar world, basically, at this moment?
Not really. I mean, when the Cold War ended, I think you could use the term unipolar, which is to say one power was so much greater than any of the others that you couldn't even imagine a working coalition against them because there was no two powers even had enough capability to resist. And of course, as you expand the size of coalitions, the problem of coalition management grows up. So if you need a really large coalition to oppose the Americans, you're probably not going to be very successful. What actually has happened in the last 30 years is Russia got off the mat where we knocked it in 1991 and glued themselves back together, right? And the Chinese economy, by emulating ours, has grown at a prodigious rate. So there's now a pair of powers who, in combination, can create a lot of obstacles for us. We still are more capable than they are, but it's not the kind of overarching, overawing capability that we had in the first decade or so after the Cold War ended. In my opinion, there are others who disagree with me, by the way.
Yeah, well, we have this beautiful advantage of geography, as you mentioned earlier, ever since at the end of the Triassic era, 190 million years ago, when North America separated from Pangaea and we got these two oceans, we've had this security blanket that geography has afforded us. One of the terms that you talked about in your book that seems relevant at this very exact moment are reckless drivers. And maybe we're in a demolition derby with some of these reckless drivers, specifically in Israel. I mean, even yesterday, last night, when I heard about this what, I don't
Yeah.
even really fully know the impact of it.
Nobody else does either.
Maybe they just dropped a slinky down there with the Israel flag on it, just to show, hey, we can get here in case
Yeah.
you want to know this, just as a heads up for the future. But that jumped out at me when I read your book, Reckless Drivers. I'm in a demolition derby at this moment. I feel like that rang extremely true to the current moment.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of reckless drivers, and I'm in a funny position here because I'm kind of sympathetic to some of the things the Israelis are doing now on the basis of their situation. But holding that aside, the basic concept of reckless driving is that it stems from another term, moral hazard, right? Which remember we heard a lot of in the financial crisis. And basically, the idea is when you have a really lush insurance policy, you may behave recklessly, right? And the Americans, vis-a-vis their allies, we're really kind of pretty generous with our allies, right? And by promising them all kinds of support, delivering them weapons, aligning with them, signing formal alliances depending on who they are, and then having our own ideology where we basically talk up just the world historical importance of our coalition to us, right? We give our allies the idea that, we can probably make a little mischief on our own here, and Big Daddy will let us get away with it. And they do. And that's where there's really two concepts here. One is reckless driving, and the other is cheap riding. Right. And they're both cousins. They're both descendants of moral hazard, right? Too much insurance, right?
That no fault insurance.
Right. Yeah. So the cheap riders for many years were the allies we had in Europe and Asia who were rich enough to defend themselves but didn't bother. They did a little something, especially in the post-Cold War period, but not nearly enough even to keep their powder dry, which is the minimum thing you should be doing in international politics, even if you're us, right? You should be keeping your powder dry. They weren't even really doing that, right? And that was one of the targets of my book, was the cheap riders. But then the others are the reckless drivers, is the allies that, we make them feel so secure that they look around and say, well, here's something I'd like to do. Maybe the Americans have told me not to do it, but I think I can get away with it, right? And the Israelis have been reckless drivers. Taiwanese at various times have been reckless drivers. I had some other favorite reckless drivers in my list back in the day, and now I can't recall them. We have allies that do things that, we say, look, we'd rather you didn't do this. And they go, yeah, but, we know you'll be busy with one of your other clients tomorrow. And while you're busy with one of your other clients, we'll do this. And, the Israelis, I would say I was very critical in the book 10 years ago about, Bibi had only been around for, I guess, a decade by then, and now it's two. But I was very critical of the Israeli policies in the occupied territories, especially in the West Bank. I said, look, we have, not only do we not have an interest in the settler project, it's actually inimical to our interest because we're trying to do other things across the Arab world. And it just makes us look like hypocrites, annoys them, and serves no purpose other than, gluing together the extreme edges of the right-wing coalition and satisfying a few nationalists, religious, we can use the word extremists, right? And that's reckless. And even now, I mean, the fact that the settler movement in the West Bank is taking advantage of all the other things that are going on to press the boundaries of their neighborhoods even harder, it's reckless driving, and it's not helpful, especially under the circumstances where the Americans are being very supportive of the Israelis otherwise. It's really not helpful. The attack on Iran last night, I'm not sure that was the reckless driving. I think the Israelis were all impressionistically, it seems they were very judicious. I should say, I don't think it was a slinky, but it was as close to an attack it appears to be as close to an attack by model airplanes.
Yeah.
As you could,
so the Israeli slinky in Isfahan just going.
They were little drones, did something, and it's not clear exactly what it was, but it was a knock on the door. But the bolder thing was when the Israelis bombed that building in Damascus, which they claim not to be part of the Iranian embassy, but the Iranians do. And they killed those Iranian Republican Guard generals and colonels. Now, those guys might have had it coming. They might indeed have been, unindicted co-conspirators of the original
Mhm.
Hamas attack on October 7th, but that doesn't mean attacking them then and there was necessarily a smart thing to do. And you could have an argument as this is an example of reckless driving. Yeah, maybe it is, right?
One of the things that's curious to me is Iran doesn't share a border with Israel. I don't even know what the distance is between the closest two points.
Hundreds of miles.
Hundreds of miles.
For an Israeli fighter plane to attack Iran, under most circumstances, it requires aerial refueling at least once along the
Exactly.
way.
And I don't know if you got a straight shot too. You might have to go around and loop through.
Well, you have to find, you can't really go around. That's not supportable, a sustainable basis. But you do have to cross the territory of some other countries. And right now, I think the preferred territory is probably Syria because the part that Israel would have to cross is actually not under the control of the Syrian government right now. It's actually under our control.
Oh, okay. So there's
No one likes to admit that or remembers it. But the Kurds whom we supported against ISIS, right? They
right.
still control about a third of Syria, and that's the third that the Israeli can fly over. It's the third that goes out the panhandle over to the Iraqi border.
Right. So just as for my kind of this curious question is that, like I said, there's no border between. Wait a minute. Iran isn't even an Arab country. This is called
Correct.
Arab-Israeli conflict.
Correct.
Oh, wait a minute. I don't think that Iran has had any historical or religious or racial affinity with Palestinians, who in fact aren't all Islamic, or there are many Christians. And so I'm kind of curious, like, how did this become the reason for this Islamic Republic? We're just going to be
even odder than you say. Before the Shah was deposed, Israel and Iran had pretty good relations.
exactly,
Actually.
and Jews had been in Iran since the beginning of time.
Yeah, there have been. Yeah, I don't claim to be an expert on the Middle East. To be a Middle East expert in the truest sense, you more or less have to have committed most of your life to that problem and most of your scholarly career. And even then, there'd be lots that you didn't understand. And you'd be a prisoner of the flip side, which is you start being too inside the thing and you can't explain it to anyone else who isn't in it, right? So, as you say, here is Iran post the overthrow of the Shah. So you look at Iran in the region. Iran is big and everyone else is relatively small. Iran has a population now of nearly what? I want to say 80 million. I don't believe it's that high, but my brain is cheating me, but it's a very large population. And other than Egypt, I don't believe there is an Arab country whose population is even close to the population of Iran. And in the Gulf area, near Iran, the Arab countries are all much weaker than Iran. So Iran is big and strong where others are weak. Iran is Persian where others are Arab. Iran is Shia where most, but not all, are Sunni. Right? So here's Iran, which has a lot of interesting ideas about the marriage of nation and religion to foreign policy. But it's also a country that has a incredible paranoia about the United States and its power and the tendency of the Americans to want to do them ill. Right? So what the Iranian Revolution has basically been doing is trying to get as much strategic elbow room as they can in that part of the world. And because for nationalist reasons, cultural reasons, and every other kind of reason you can imagine, everybody there plays a rough game. The Iranians tend to want a lot of elbow room if they can get it. And that means they end up inevitably threatening their neighbors. And their neighbors inevitably come running to us because we're the only ones who can really defend them, which in turn makes the Iranians feel even more paranoid, right? And causes them to engage, helps them. I shouldn't say causes, because it's not the only cause, because their own internal ideas are part of the cause, stimulates them to be even more aggressive and more interventionist. So my cynical theory about the Iranians is that getting married to the Palestinian cause and making themselves the defenders of Jerusalem, which after all the holy places there are holy to Shias and Sunnis, Muslim, is their way of laundering themselves in the Arab world, where inherently they are in fact a threat. This is why the countries that are Arab countries that are closest to them really tend to hug us closely. And in recent years have even made common cause with Israel, which they never
Right.
used to do, right? It's because they're pretty scared of the Iranians, and you should be. The Iranians are a capable, motivated, and tough bunch, right? I mean, remember, the Iranians were selling weapons to the Russians,
Right.
right? Which they designed, right? Now, they're not that fancy, but they're extremely serviceable in their way, right? And this is a good example. The Iranians are, these are people are not to be taken lightly, right?
Right.
Right. So they basically picked up all of the alienated and or marginalized and or fearful groups in the Arab world and made alignments with them. And this means mostly Shiite populations who are other than Iraq, they tend to be, kind of minority populations, and therefore they feel afraid. And Shia-Sunni relations have been checkered over the years in the history of Islam, right? So they made common cause. And of course, those populations that are living closest to Israel are the ones that themselves have had their own brawls with Israel. Obviously, the Palestinians are one, and that's not a Shiite population, that's Sunni. But Hezbollah is a Shiite organization. The Houthis, I believe, have I can't remember what the Houthi affinity is with Shiism. I can't remember if they were Shiites
I don't know.
or that they were in a related branch. And in Syria, the Alawites have some common precepts with Shiism. So what Iran has done is picked up the flotsam and jetsam. I'm being mean here, but picked
Right.
up the more unusual or special groups in the Arab world with which they have some affinity,
Hmm.
and taken on the Palestinian cause and their own identity as picked up the defender of the holy places idea to try and essentially launder their power, legitimate it, and to give them more strategic reach, because, as you say, they are far away from Israel. And the flip side is the Israelis have been very neuralgic about the Iranian revolution since the beginning, in part because the Iranians have been nasty to them.
Hmm.
And the Iranians say horrible things about Israel. They have adopted an eliminationist rhetoric. And of course, when you see a country that appears to be strongly committed to a ethno-religious ideology and happens to be big and strong and happens to have taken up the cause of those of your adversaries and happens to have developed a hobby in the nuclear energy business, it seems like it could turn into a nuclear weapon. The Israelis are pretty darn neuralgic about Iran. And interestingly, so are we, but we're neuralgic about them for different but analogous reasons. So you ask complicated questions about, which is a really good question, like, because I get, you know, when this whole business started, I said, wait a second, what is it I believe about this again? And I had to kind of go through my own head, recovering my own organization of the problem, because it's not naturally in your frontal lobes, which is, how did we get to this exactly? Right. So anyway, I've given you my encapsulated view. I'm sure others would give you a different view, but I think that gives you at least a map you can map on other people's ideas on.
It makes sense because actually, to me, the Iran is a volcano that's just bubbling within its own borders with dissent.
It's a paranoid regime because there are many Iranians. It's clear that many Iranians don't like the Orthodox lifestyle that the clergy has imposed on it, and the clergy and the clerical regime and its secret police can be pretty horrible in Iran,
Yes.
and it doesn't endear them to. I'm guessing, I don't know much about the demography and the kind of underground politics in Iran, but I'm guessing that it's in the larger cities, and as you get closer to the whatever the middle class is, that's where you probably get your strongest reaction to the regime.
Yeah, my most recent podcast with this writer Arash Azizi, who's written a book called "What Iranians Want." It's
Yeah, yeah,
a summary of dissent
yeah.
in Iran. But one of the things, I mean, just to speak about it, I mean, I had a personal, I had a surgery last year. I mean, it was Iranian doctors, Iranian nurses. I get the hiccups. It's,
Yeah.
Iranian, like we are the beneficiary of so much
Yeah, well, especially the Los Angeles area where you are.
Exactly,
Yeah.
talent, not to mention the radio station or
Yeah,
two.
yeah, yeah.
So,
I think it's the only commercially viable Farsi language radio station in America, isn't it?
exactly. So their loss is frankly our gain. I mean, you
Yeah,
talk about we're the beneficiary of a
yeah.
lot of Persian talent. As tragic as it is, it seems like there's the possibility for a rearrangement of a new world order if Israel and its leadership can come to some kind of understanding with their neighbors. Because as you just mentioned, there's Saudi Arabia, reaching out, and the UAE, and I think Morocco already. That there could be this new bargain that might bode well for just peace and tranquility and security for Israel.
There has been potential for a new regional order,
Right.
and the Netanyahu coalition doesn't want to explore that potential because they don't like the price. And elements in his coalition, and for all I know, Netanyahu himself still entertain the idea that there never will be and never can be a Palestinian state. Inherently, it's too threatening to the state of Israel. And of course, members of his coalition are not merely naysayers on that score. They are the settler movement that wants to basically recreate the biblical state of Israel. And unless and until that coalition can be toppled because they got to govern Israel fair and square within Israeli rules, and unfortunately, Israeli law does not specify an election for another year or two. And the only way this coalition will fall is if members of Netanyahu's own party go against him. And of course, their power position depends on remaining the way it is. So the Israelis have had a very hard time grasping the possibilities present to them. That said, they may have been able to generate enough of a compromise to allow the Biden-led Abraham Accords 2 process to go to fruition. But Hamas saw that process as inimical to their interests as an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And they started this war in part to prevent that process from coming to fruition. But when we look at the nature of the attack itself, they made it very hard for any Israeli moderate to be supportive of the idea of a Palestinian state. And very few Israeli citizens at this moment would endorse a Palestinian state, right? And Hamas, in an effort to remind the Gulf states and the United States of their existence and their influence, has behaved in a way that has convinced not just the Israelis, but I actually think maybe the Gulf states, their leaders in any way, that Hamas really does need to be eliminated. And if not eliminated, then significantly suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Israeli war in Gaza is inherently ugly to watch because of the structure of the situation. It's very hard to fight in cities. And it's very hard to fight
Tunnels.
an adversary that's done such really impressive subterranean engineering. But the Israelis are in a position where even Israeli moderates are not willing to live with Hamas. And so this situation is, it's hard to see a way out of this and see a way through it. I commend the Biden administration for kind of doing the best they can to try and still find a way out of this. But Hamas has made itself a veto player, and I haven't heard a good solution for that. The Israeli solution is only partly plausible, but nobody else has any solution. So international politics is always tough, and in the Middle East, it's really tough.
The only thing I would say, and I don't offer it as a solution, I offer it as sort of a historical reminder. I can remember, as I'm sure you do, in the mid 60s, where no enemy seemed more intractable to Israel, more hopeless, more daunting, really more existentially threatening than the Egyptians.
Yes.
In a number of wars.
Yeah.
You know better than me, but I'm just going to say 48, 56, 67, and 73. That's a lot of wars.
It is.
And as horrible as we maybe characterize these Palestinians or the Hamas, it still didn't seem as threatening to me as the specter of untold millions of Egyptians that shared.
This is correct. Yeah, this is correct.
And they made peace, and it still lasts. And at this moment, they are collaborating over these.
This is true. This is all true.
And so, while I don't have the answer, I say it isn't hopeless. And
no, it isn't hopeless. And I think, the Americans and at one time the Israelis had put some stock in the so-called Palestinian Authority, which was dominated to some extent by al-Fatah, which itself had a fairly checkered history, right? And this is again, we come back to the problem of politics being an interactive thing where each creates a reality for the other, and then you have to, it takes a lot of unwinding to get to some new mutually created reality, but there has to be some will to do it. And on the part of, again, the Netanyahu coalition, even after deals were signed with Fatah and the PA, and there was a process set in place that was meant to lead to a kind of a better organization and ultimately to Palestinian statehood, the negotiations, the relationship was ruined by the actions of and inactions of both parties, right? And the possibility of rebuilding that relationship exists in a way that it doesn't exist with Hamas. This thing that Hamas did was just really kind of off the charts. Yeah. And it's just hard to come back from something like that.
I'm in these kind of conversations a lot. Yeah. And one of the things I try and say is, first, I would say that the Palestinian people in Gaza are as much victims of Hamas as the Israelis. Certainly, they knew that an attack on this scale and this brutality would invite a viperous, malicious, overarching response that would just be a nightmare.
Hamas was looking for some sort of a big response. You don't mount an attack like that without having some reaction in mind.
Exactly. So they're victims too. I mean, the suffering is catastrophic. And then I go back to this book, the Tom Friedman book, and I remember the thing that stuck out. One of the big comments was the greatest Zionist of them all, arguably, was Ben-Gurion.
Yeah.
And he even recognized around 48, as Friedman said, that Israel couldn't have, let's say, the biblical version of Israel, Judea and Samaria, to the sea, democracy and security. You can't get all three. Pick two, and let's go. And he knew that.
Yeah.
In spite of these deep ancient wishes for this larger territory, he realized, and it comes back to sort of your point of view, you're a realist. And to me, reality sometimes just is staring you in the face.
And again, this is the case of historical contingency, which is it's the 1967 war that put Gaza and the West Bank back in Israeli hands. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, well, this is what I call the 200-act play problem in the Middle East, which is the people who live there remember every act in the play and how it was constitutive of the next act, and the rest of us who can't stand to pay attention to this 200-act play come back in and watch 20 or 30 acts, and we realize that there's 50 acts that we forgot or never knew anything about, and that's explaining things. And the 1967 war was a humongous big change in the structure of the thing, and after the Israelis conquered the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, Golan, they expected people to knock on their door and offer, peace agreements, and it didn't happen, right? And the occupation over time gave scope for the Israeli settler movement, for the other wing of Israeli politics, the Likud wing, Beginite wing, fundamentalists, you can call them. I mean, use whatever term you want to say, okay, well, the land is here. Let's go back and see what happens. Let's get some real estate. Let's build some kibbutzes. Let's, and start using the hurly-burly of Israeli politics to try and realized this old dream that Ben Gurion had given up, but maybe Menachem Begin and his followers had not given up, right? And why and how did this war happen? Well, it was precipitated by actions by Abdel Nasser of basically taking the 56 truce, which necessitated the Egyptians not having large armored forces in the Sinai and deciding to put large armored forces in the Sinai. Now, what he really intended to do with them, not clear, right? But the Israeli view was we're not living this way with like several armored divisions with hundreds of tanks right up next to our border. We're going to wage war now. And, you can debate whether the war was preemptive or preventive or whatever it was, but that was the precipitating event. And you say, well, why didn't anyone stop this? Well, the only people who could have stopped it was the United States. And why didn't we stop it? Because it was 1967. And what else was going on in 1967? Where we started this conversation, busy in Vietnam, right? It's history is just one damn thing after another. That's unwinding it. I think we've at least achieved that understanding in this conversation that this is a complicated thing with terrible consequences.
And I was hoping we could solve it all in this hour in my podcast.
Every time I do one of these, which I do from time to time, I think that one of my interlocutors will manage to elicit from me the Solomonic solution to many of our problems, but it never happens. And it's not the fault of my interlocutors, and it's not even my fault. It's the problems are intractable. We have to manage them. And I think, many of the things you said imply a kind of a managerial solution, which is that, with a little bit of political creativity, we could find a better way to manage the politics of the Middle East. And it's sort of, through a cloudy lens, we can kind of see it, but there's a lot of things in the way.
Yes.
Right. Hamas and Bibi Netanyahu, they end up being tacit obstructionist allies.
They are.
And it's very sad.
Which, one of the things, and I'll try and wrap this up, is like you're right, they are in a kind of unholy alliance in lockstep with each other. And I'm sure you've talked or thought about this, but to wage war, both parties almost have to agree to wage. There have to be an agreement to wage war.
I agree with that. I often say this. It's not just that. It's even within war, almost every battle is an agreement to fight then and there rather than somewhere else. Right. That is correct. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things about Gandhi is he said, well, wait, I don't have to agree.
Yes.
And that I think is at sort of at the core of some of his philosophies.
Yeah.
Studied it and read about it and wrote about it in my own screenplays. I was going to pose this maybe as a closing thought because this idea of nonviolence, is it just a utopian kind of quaint, innocent idea that doesn't really comport with realism? Or maybe is there some truth there and some effectiveness that can be harnessed?
I'm an admirer of nonviolence and a skeptic of its utility.
There you go.
I can't help but echo an often cynical observation that many people make about nonviolence, which is it works better if you practice it against an Anglo-Saxon democratic society, a liberal democratic Anglo-Saxon society, not so well against some other societies, right? It doesn't mean that it could never work in those places, but it means that the price to the nonviolent is really high in some places. It's way, it's as high as the price has been of the American Civil Rights Movement or in Gandhi's efforts against the British, right? You try that kind of activity and look at Belarus. The opposition in Belarus couldn't have been more peaceful, right? It doesn't even seem to have been in their genes to approach getting rid of Lukashenko with violent means. And they were just entirely suppressed, imprisoned, beaten up, locked up, exiled, suppressed, bingo, right? And, Lukashenko will fall someday and maybe there'll be a different moment, but, thugs can be pretty darn thuggish. Now, in relations among states, nonviolence is hard to practice because it's hard to get a whole country to practice nonviolence.
Right.
And second of all, against whom, right? So, you can see the way Russia is governed. You can see the way China is governed. Would you really like to try opening your borders and letting them take your country and trying nonviolent resistance against them after they've turned up? Doesn't look that attractive, right?
Yeah. Well, nonviolence doesn't offer you protection against violence, that's for sure. I think it generally is more effective within a state.
Against some state structures, they can be remarkably creative at generating their own clouds of thugs who are willing to kill and die for the regime.
But when it's state versus state genocidal, I think even Gandhi came up short when he was asked, Muhammad, great. Well, what about those Nazis? And I was like, well, I don't know if he had a satisfying answer at that moment.
Well, there isn't going to be a satisfying answer, right? You could admire a country that might try it. It could be surrender early and often as a national strategy and don't bother the occupier very much. They'll leave sooner or later. The horror of a violent clash is too great. And people aren't this way. And the long time can be a really long time, and the occupiers could be really awful. It's a big commitment.
Yes, and it takes tremendous discipline and training. Maybe it's just something that's worth understanding and knowing and in your toolbox, but there maybe should be some other tools as well. Professor Barry Posen, this has been not only a pleasure, but a delight, extremely illuminating. And I want to thank you not only just for yourself, but for your scholarship and a lifetime of thinking about these issues that indubitably started when you were playing toy soldiers in your room as a kid, but it's now at the pinnacle of academia. So congratulations on the book. I want to recommend it because I think it's still, for people that live in this world, it's definitely worth reading. I got it on Apple Books, so it was a couple clicks away, and it's called Restraint: A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy. Check it out. It's a dense read, but
not a long book.
And there's some timely truths in it in terms of just U.S. overreach and blowback. To the folks out there, thank you for joining me. You can subscribe to my Vibe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. See ya.